All right, hi guys. So we're just gonna look through some of these questions that were asked. There were many of you that asked a diverse range of questions. So I think the first thing I want to start with is in terms of the 4 strategies that I talked about in the lecture, the clarification, trench warfare, meta rebuttal, and value adding. The first thing I want to say is don't worry about the labels themselves, right? So there are a couple of questions who asked about the naming of those and whether or not we use the word trench warfare, for instance. Please don't use those words in the speech. They are not important at all. Just remember the strategy that is being employed as opposed to the labels given to it. The labels are purely to help you like visualize or understand what that strategy looks like. Don't worry about the actual naming of the label. The second part of this is about which strategy to use in which point at which point in time. And I think the important thing to recognize here is that this could change from debate to debate and based on the strategies that your opponents employ. So it is unlikely that there is a fixed structure that says like first speaker does value add, second speaker does trench warfare. It is unlikely for there to be such kinds of labeling. What is likely is that you will have to adapt based on what happens in the debate. What is the most efficient is that obviously clarification should happen as early as possible. So second speakers should probably be doing the most amount of clarification work as opposed to by third speakers. It might be a bit late if you are like clarifying the details of your policy at third opposition, right? So there are some clarification should happen early, but any of the other 3 categories could happen at any point in time in the debate. I'm inclined to think maybe most of the meta rebuttal stuff are likely to happen at third speaker. That's just because that's how we envision the third speaker role in terms of identifying clashes and that kind of thing. Which brings us, I think, to all of the questions about the third speaker speech in general. And I know the lecture itself never really focused on it because we were thinking of just rebuttals in general and rebuttals that apply to all the speakers of the debate across the board. So let's talk about third speakers specifically. And a lot of the questions that happen in this Google form were asking about what counts as new material and what doesn't. So there are a few things here. The first is, I think, if the idea is brand new to the judges, then it is considered new matter. That means if it is something the judges have never previously been introduced to before. Therefore, if you are just merely responding to something that happened in the speaker before you, that is your job as a third speaker to engage with and therefore won't be considered new matter. If you are giving another example to fortify an argument that happened in your second speaker, it is an argument that has already happened before, therefore that is not new matter. If you are defending what has happened in your first speaker because your opponents attacked it, that is not new matter because the argument has already existed and the exchange already existed in the debate. So don't worry about sounding like a lot of what you're saying is new matter. It is not. As long as what you're doing is defending your teammates, adding to the examples or the layers of analysis of an argument that already exists. If you are engaging or responding to something that happened in your opponents, none of this is new matter. All of this is just part of what is the role of a third speaker. What is new matter is if this is the very first time an idea is happening. For instance, if you take an argument that has happened in your second speaker and spin a new conclusion out of it, that is new matter because the other side had no chance to respond to this new conclusion that you are reaching. The other thing that could be considered new matter is if, for instance, as third opposition, you are rebutting to a substantive from first proposition for the first time down the bench, right? Admittedly, I think in terms of strategy, it is probably much better to have the rebuttal late than to not have it at all. So in the way up of whether or not you should make the rebuttal, you probably should, but I would not waste too much time on it because some judges might view that as completely new matter and disregard it. So don't waste time on that. But as much as possible, do engage with everything that happens on the other side, but hopefully everything that should be engaged earlier in the debate would not be your responsibility for the most part, because your first and second speakers should have done it as well. The other question that was asked about third speakers is whether or not the third speaker can make clarifications of policies. It is perfectly fine if these are things that were said in your first speech, but that your opponents have misconstrued or have not heard or have misrepresented in any way, then yes, a third speaker absolutely can come up and go, just to reinforce what our policy was, clarifying this detail because there's been some confusion about it, you can clarify it. However, if the first speaker in your team wasn't clear or was super vague about how the policy was phrased, and then in third speaker you come up and are like, actually we have a 6-step policy process, let me clarify, and then give the 6 steps, that's not clarification anymore, that's a brand new thing, that's new matter. So it also depends on what you consider clarification. If you're just reinforcing something that has already happened in your team, absolutely okay. Just don't like make up new things that happened in the debate at that point. Then that's not clarification. Is there a good structure to carry out third speaker speeches so it doesn't turn out to be messy or repetitive? Absolutely. I think the important thing about third speaker speeches is that even though we say that third speaker speeches are all about rebuttal, it is not meant to be a chronological rebuttal speech. That means you don't spend 6 minutes just going rebuttal 1, rebuttal 2, rebuttal 3, rebuttal 4, rebuttal 5, right? The point of a third speaker speech is to find clashes. And clashes are the main themes of the entire debate that both sides have discussed in the context of the speeches. There are a few different ways to do this. One of them is to think about them is in terms of principle clash, policy clash, and then consequence clash. So everything to do with the discussion about the principles of the debate or the morals of the debate get discussed first. Then the feasibility of the policies, proposition policy versus opposition policy, is clash number 2. And then clash number 3 is all of the harms and benefits that were discussed. And then which harm outweighs which benefit happens at the end. That's one way to look at it. The second way to look at it is to think about the different stakeholders of the debate and to split them accordingly. So for instance, if you're looking at like a schools or education motion, then impact on children is one clash, impact on parents is one clash, impact on school and teachers is another clash. And then you split them up and make all of your rebuttals differentiated that way. That way, you don't overlap in terms of content, you don't overlap in terms of rebuttal, and therefore you split that up. The last strategy to how to structure third speeches, I think, is focused mostly on your content and your burdens. And this is going to like overlap a little bit with how reply speeches are formed. But if you identify what your burdens of proof are, and then you can say, look, in order to win this debate, we had to prove 2-3 things. In these 3 things, this is how we have gone. So we're going to base it based on each of these clashes based on the burdens of proof. That's perfectly okay as well. I would suggest the most effective starting point, if you're starting to learn how to do third speaker speeches, is to start with the principle, policy, and consequence clashes, because that's a more clean division of how these clashes function. Which brings us, I guess, to the questions about burdens of proof themselves. One of the questions asked whether or not there were multiple burdens of proof in the debate, and absolutely there are. And I think it is important to identify them as separate questions because it is a lot easier to answer as opposed to like one large question, which is just the motion with a question mark at the end. The cheat code that I give to the kids that I coach is that there are 3 basic burdens of proof that exist in most policy debates. They are, is this necessary? Is this effective? And is there more harm than good? So let's say the motion is, this house will ban smoking. We first have to prove, and we have a burden to prove that this policy is necessary. So smoking is bad, is something we have to prove. we then have to prove that this is effective, that banning in and of itself is something that will work. And then 3, we have to prove that there will be more good in this scenario than harm, that there is a net benefit from this policy. Each of these 3 things are 3 separate burdens of proof that side proposition has. Obviously, these 3 labels don't apply to all motions. Some motions have more burdens of proof, some motions have less, some motions have a different variation of what these burdens are. But the questions that you ask in burdens of proof also develop into what you should rebut and what you shouldn't rebut. Yeah. Summarizing of the burdens themselves are not exclusively a third speaker or reply speaker job. This is something you can do right at the first speaker speech, right? And just to be like, these are the burdens we are going to defend in this debate. And then every speaker followed by can follow by saying, we said we are going to defend these 3 burdens. This is how we are defending these 3 burdens. And then like rebut each of those burdens separately or specifically. That's basically on that. All right. The last thing then is on this whole bit about like how third speaker should structure and what third speaker should do is, should we rebut a rebuttal? I would say absolutely. That is part of creating defense value for yourself. It is not just about constantly attacking the other side, but it's also about defending your own speech and your own case on your side. So many coaches have used this analogy before, and think about it as 2 buildings being built, and each team is trying to build their own skyscraper. What you have to do is to take a swing at their skyscraper so that your building is always taller than theirs. But the thing to always remember is that if you constantly take a swing at theirs, but you're not rebuilding your own, at the end of the debate, both of you are going to have no building, and there's no point to that. So if you want a winning case of the debate, make sure that while you're taking a swing at their building, 1, that you're not like, the swing doesn't go in 180 degrees and swing back at yourself. So make sure that all of the rebuttals you make are mutually exclusive. But 2, also that as much as of effort that you put into taking swings at their building, you're also rebuilding your own foundation and your own skyscraper. So absolutely rebut rebuttals as well. Make sure you defend your arguments. Make sure you defend your case as strongly as possible. All right, some other questions that we want to look at here. How to engage with an opponent if the opponent rebuts with a counter example. I would suggest to try to not engage in an example war. So if the argument that's being made by the other side is attached to a single example, I would suggest not clashing example to example, because it is incredibly easy to just be like, neither of those examples matter, they sort of wash out each other, they don't have any value. So definitely engage with the point that they were trying to achieve with that example and rebut the main argument as opposed to the example. So even if your opponent does this, right? If your opponent stands up and says, their example is wrong, here's another example to fortify it, I wouldn't like respond to that with a third example. I would just be like, sure, maybe that example is true, but that example is anecdotal evidence. It's only 1 out of thousands of possibilities. Here is the analysis and the logic that backs up our first example just now. It's not about the example, it's about the analysis that happens that proves that that example is valuable. So don't clash example to example that way. What's the most effective way to rebut something that's coming from an opponent when you're very lost in the debate or their mechanism is quite strong? I would say that obviously if you are really in the weeds and have no idea as to how to clash with something that is super strong, the best case scenario would be to focus on fortifying your own case. So you do everything you can to defend their case, and you do everything you can to attack their case, and whatever parts of the case that you can take down, you should. But if you really think that you have no capacity to take down their case and you don't know enough to be able to figure out how to take down their case, then worry more about defending your own case. spend more time analyzing the logic behind your own arguments, your own examples, that kind of thing. So that, again, worst case scenario, even if you can't bring down their skyscraper, maybe your own skyscraper is taller than theirs, right? So think about which strategy best works for defending your own case in that moment. But also, I think, make use of information that you can garner from an edge call. So if you get a motion that you really don't know anything about, you have no basis to understand what the motion is even talking about, you can go approach the edge call and be like, hi, can you explain this motion to me? And the edge call is obligated to give you some basic information, so some basic definitional help about what the words in the motion mean, or some sort of basic information to help you understand what the main clashes of the debate are. In that scenario, use that information to craft what your clashes are, craft what your burdens of proof are, and go from there. All right. How do we make certain points more relevant during the debate? I actually think in debating, relevance comes from exposure in the debate. So if you spend enough time making an argument about it, making examples, defending it in rebuttals, it becomes relevant, right? So if you say it once in the first speech and then never mention it again for the rest of the debate, you have made your own argument irrelevant. So I think the biggest way to make something relevant is to constantly defend it, constantly make sure that it is at the forefront of the judge's mind by making rebuttals about it, making clashes about it, repeating it in reply speech, and gain the kind of consistency from there. How to deal with trick question POIs given by the opponent. I would say the best way to deal with POI, so definitely like take the 2 seconds you need to think about what that question is before you answer. Don't run into answering the question. But if there are some questions when they're asked, you on face value know that there is no reason for this question to be asked. But if you think about it, there's probably a trick reason why they're asking this. I would like make generic claims so that you don't get caught in the trap of how you answered that question. So obviously this is not the most it doesn't show the most amount of integrity in the way you answer this. But if the answer to the question is tricky, then the way to do it is to just be like, look, if this is in line with our principal values, then we absolutely would do this. I'm not sure what the value of this is yet. Maybe explain it a bit more and then we will answer it in our next speech. Or something to the effect where you sort of dismiss the necessity for an answer to that question because you don't quite understand what the point you're getting at is or what the trick in the question is yet. Then avoid giving straightforward, like direct answers to just that, but to just be like, in general, in a bunch of these other circumstances, we would or we wouldn't do this. But you can explain more, a few more detail later, maybe something to the effect. But that is only true if the question truly is like this super sneaky, snaky trick question that is being asked. For all other questions, as much as possible, give straightforward answers that are easy to understand and easy to grasp. Other sneaky questions, you can like dodge the question a bit, but for straightforward POIs, definitely answer them directly. This is also true for like, if they ask you a POI about something you don't really know, as much as possible, give straightforward answers. If you don't know how to answer a POI, then you can like dodge it a little bit and to just be like, we will handle this later, or we will figure this out in the later substantive or in a later argument or something to the effect. As much as possible, please don't sabotage your teammates. So if you're the first proposition speaker, for instance, don't go up and in response to a POI say, oh, don't worry, my second speaker will handle it, or my third speaker will handle it. It is literally like sabotaging your teammates for no reason, because now the judges are like waiting for your opponents to answer this question. So if you really don't know the answer to this question, to a POI, just sort of like fudge around it and be like, oh, this is going to be answered in the argument later, or I already answered this when I said XYZ earlier, or something to the effect, and then move on. And then if your second and third speaker do know the answer to the question, let them pick it up and handle it properly. But if they don't, at least the spotlight hasn't been put on them to do so, right? So don't like sabotage your teammates by saying, oh, my later speakers will cover this. There was one more question here. Does the so what response in a rebuttal constitute a comparison between proposition and opposition's word? Yes, for the most part. I think what a so what response is improving why it is valuable to this debate and why it is valuable to be considered as part of your case. So yes, a comparison is part of a so what response is a part of building a comparison between your side and the other side and talking about it in that sense. And the furthermore tier for rebuttal is the same as the so what tier that I talked about. So some of you in coaching have been taught to do not true even if furthermore. The furthermore can fall in two ways. It can be considered either a second even if tier, or it can be a so what tier. It's about the same thing. All right, let's talk about the fallacies part of the lecture, because there are a few questions there. So just as a equity discussion, because I mentioned in the lecture a little bit about equity violations and where they form, and there was a question about this. No, all fallacies are not equity violations. Ad hominem attacks, where you attack the speaker directly, is an equity violation. All of the other fallacies are logical problems that create holes in your case, but they're not equity issues for the tournament. They will just not be as persuasive to the judge. On that front of equity discussions, I would steer away from any and all comments that make it sound like your opponents as people are at fault, as opposed to their case not being clear. So one of the questions that was asked is like, what if I want to say that they didn't have an adequate policy and they didn't do their homework on constructing their policy? Is that an ad hominem still? I think that is on the verge of being an ad hominem, even though it's not a direct insult. So I would avoid making any claims that sound like you're accusing the speakers of doing something, as opposed to just saying that an argument is unclear. If you want to attack the policy, just attack the policy, right? Say this policy doesn't achieve the following few things, therefore it is insufficient. Rather than saying you didn't do your work with this policy, that is an ad hominem attack. So just choose how you phrase those kinds of things to make it clear. This is also true for like accusing your opponent of not listening to you or not hearing what you're saying. Be very careful of saying you didn't do something. If it is something you've already mentioned, then the claim should just be, I just mentioned this, let me say it again, or I just mentioned this, I'm not going to talk about it again. So you can imply that they didn't hear it, but don't explicitly be like, you didn't hear it, it's your fault. Right? That's an ad hominem attack. So avoid going in that direction. Phrase it more carefully. There was a question here about strawmans earlier. Oh, when dealt with strawmans, how do we point out the exaggeration? I would say the first thing to do is to absolutely point out the strawman, right? So to be able to just be, look, our point was X. Oh, responded to Y. That is not the point we were going for. This is the point we were going for. Therefore, that rebuttal doesn't stand. The second part of it is to then go, even if that response is true or that response matches with our main point, here is why that end game or end goal is still wrong. So when dealing with strawmans, it's not just good enough to point out that that is a strawman, but to also be like, even if it is not a strawman, the end goal that they wanted to achieve is not likely to happen. It's not the truth of what it is. This is what the comparison really is. Like, do some work to bring the debate back to the original point that was initially stated. So like, don't fall into the hole of like making sweeping statements about what your opponent has done. Do some work to break down each of the individual arguments that they are making, even if some of them are strawmans. Like, do the work to break the logic down even in those ideas. Are there any more? Sorry, give me a second. Okay, note taking. Can we do note taking before the debate? I think you can identify burdens of proof before the debate and obviously in prep. You can do the basic structures of note taking if you want to, but I wouldn't do any detailed note taking before the debate because you need to be able to be adaptable to what happens in the debate. That's the same reason why, for instance, rebuttal sheets when you have the 1 week prep time are great. They're great in order to like help you see what the comparisons are and to help you identify what loopholes you might have in your case. But if you go up to a debate round with a fully written prepped rebuttal sheet, then you are unlikely to be as adaptable because you're going to want to make rebuttals that already exist in that square form on that paper. So don't do too much rebuttal prep in prep time. Focus on what the comparisons might be, what are the things you might have to respond to. Start thinking about that, but don't craft very fixed ideas of what rebuttals should be in prep. Focus more on your own case and all of those parts of things. Must we track our own teammate speech as well? I would say you don't have to track it in as detailed a way as you should track an opponent's speech, but you should still be fully aware of what has been covered and what hasn't been covered by your teammate. And I think there are two ways to do this. One is obviously you can track as your speaker is speaking and write down all of the things that they have said. The other way to do it, for instance, if for example, if you're super busy and you're like writing your clashes and writing your rebuttals and trying to figure out POIs and you don't have the time to listen to your opponents, this is when you depend on your teammate. So either the other teammate who is not speaking can help you do the tracking of your teammate, or when the teammate returns to sit down next to you, you can ask them to give you a piece of paper with the bullet point summary of all of the things they covered. I usually in tournaments do this via post-it notes. So I always give post-it notes to my teammate and go, can you write the headings of your substantive for me? Or can you write the 3 points of the policy for me? And then I will use those post-it notes and paste it on the relevant parts of my paper when I go up to make the speech. That way, even if I didn't have time to track my teammates will do the tracking for me and give it to me and then do it accordingly. So use the advantage of having teammates to your benefit. How would note-taking on cue cards look like? I do think cue cards are a bit more difficult for note-taking because there is such a small space to do it on. I think the best way, if that becomes a thing and you think you want to only note-take on cue cards, I wouldn't suggest it. But if you do end up choosing to want to note-take on cue cards, to do a separate ID on each card. So rebuttal 1 on one card, rebuttal 2 on the other card, substantive 1 on one card, substantive 2 on the other card, policy on one card. And then all you need to do before you go up to your speech is to organize the cards in an order that you want to prioritize the rebuttals on. And that way it's easier. Definitely the one thing about writing on cue cards, don't do double-sided writing, right? Because then you have to like flip the card and it becomes confusing for everyone if you drop a card and you flip it differently than the order you expected to. It makes it messy. If you're doing cue cards, one-sided writing, and then immediately move the cards out of the way. Make sure they're organized and numbered at the top, and then just have a separate ID on each card. And that way, the rebuttals are a lot more organized and don't overlap with one another. And if there are any points where you have to like draw arrows between two cards, then make sure those two cards are like back to back with one another, and the arrows are still can be drawn when they get connected. I think that might cover it all. Okay, you recommend good videos. I think that there is a gold mine of videos on YouTube. Particularly at the secondary school level, I would go find WSDC videos and SSSDC videos on YouTube. There are a lot of them, particularly good WSDC rounds. If you follow like the Singapore national team through a bunch of the YouTube videos they have there are a bunch of YouTube videos from the England WSDC team, as well as from the Scotland WSDC team, the Australian WSDC team. There are a lot of videos out there that are just good schools level debating videos. So definitely go use those as like the starting points for any of your prep and for any of your training, and listen to them and craft rebuttals based on their speeches, but also go listen to how they rebut and watch how they phrase their rebuttals and how they phrase their burdens of proof and that kind of thing, so that you can get a better idea of how it works. I think that might be it from the Google form, at least.
All right, if that's all from the Google Forms, we're going to move on to the second segment of the Q&A session, where we will allow you to unmute yourselves and ask any questions if you have any further questions on the topic of discussion for today. You may now unmute yourselves if you have any questions. We are unable to hear you if you are asking a question.
Oh, one other question here which I can answer, which is how many POI should we give to one opponent's speech to show that we are engaging with the opponent? I don't think that there is a fixed number on this. Obviously, try and ask like at least 2, 3, 4 POIs per speech to make sure that you are seen as engaging and knowing what you're doing. But don't heckle or berate the speaker, obviously. So don't try and do this whole like 25 POIs in one speech thing. I think as long as you ask a POI twice, 3 times in a speech, you are seen as attempting to engage. But I wouldn't put a fixed number on it in any way. Any other questions?
If there are no more questions, I think we can just end the session then. Thank you so much, Via. I hope all of you learned a lot from that lesson and the follow-up Q&A, because that was quite informative for me as well. We would like to thank the DA Exco members for putting this together. We would also like to thank our external consultant for IT, Rohan Kapoor, for making this possible, and all the people that made the test calling possible. A couple of reminders. The first is that if you are joining the next call on debate psychology, please make sure that when you join the call, your Zoom name matches the Zoom name that you've registered with. So please do not come in with only your first name. Don't come in with like, say, Joel. Come in with Joel Law, which is my full name, including my surname. So please make sure that you match it as far as you can, or to the best of your memory. Don't use any acronyms like JL if you're Joel, or don't use JL. Don't come in with a Chinese name as well, because some of us cannot read Chinese. And other than that, just make sure that when you come for the debate psychology lecture, you guys are punctual so that we can start on time, and also allocate sufficient time for asking more questions later and for the lecturer to answer those questions. All right. If anyone has no more, if anyone doesn't have any more, or rather, if we don't have any more questions, I guess we can just end the call. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Viha, for that informative lesson.